Welcome, and thank you for joining us for what should be a very stimulating conversation with Richard Clarke tonight. I'm Janice Madden, an economist and professor of regional science and sociology here at Penn. I'm also chair of the board of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, which has been closely affiliated with Penn for over 125 years. The Academy promotes the use of social science research in the design and implementation of public policy. A primary way we do this is through the publication of a bi-monthly interdisciplinary journal called the ANNALS, which is the basis for today's event. Mr. Clarke first edited an edition of a volume of the ANNALS in July of 2008. That volume was a policy briefing for the incoming US President Obama in July of 2008. And it was on global terrorism. 8 years later, today, there have been radical changes in the Middle East and violent extremism. And this led us to ask Mr. Clarke to review that work, which he and his colleagues did brilliantly in the November 2016 volume of the Annals, which was published just as Donald Trump was elected president. William Burke White, director of Perry World House, is going to do the honors of introducing Mr. Clarke to you, and we thank him and the Perry World House staff for the partnership in bringing this evening's proceedings to you. Before we turn to William, though, I'd just like to thank you publicly, Dick, for being such a good colleague and friend of the Academy. Whether or not the Trump administration takes the actions you recommend here, we thank you for the effort you put into this extraordinarily thoughtful collection of essays and analyses. We are better off for it, and so very pleased that you've taken the time to come back to your alma mater to reflect on the current state of affairs with all of us. William?
Thank you, Janice, and welcome to Perry World House. I am delighted to welcome you all here, particularly in partnership with the American Academy. It's a great partnership, and we're very, very happy to have you here. This evening, I have the privilege of introducing, I think it is fair to say, the United States' leading expert on issues of terrorism and cybersecurity. And I can think of no more important set of issues, nor a more challenging time to address those issues than we live in at the moment. Dick Clarke is the CEO of Good Harbor Security Risk Management, which is the first company I would call if I needed a cybersecurity expert. But more importantly, for 30 years, he served in the United States government, 10 continuous years as a White House official under 3 consecutive presidents. That's pretty hard to do given the turnover rates in Washington. He served as the Special Assistant to the President for Global Affairs, the Special Advisor to the President for Cyberspace, the National Coordinator for Security and Counterterrorism. He also served as a diplomat, including as Assistant Secretary of State and at the Pentagon. Since leaving government, he's played a critical role of both advocacy as an ABC News analyst and as a prolific author. It is not every day that I get to introduce someone who actually writes best-selling novels, not the academic tomes that I tend to put on a library shelf and hope my mother is the only person in the world who reads them. He actually has written Against All Enemies and Cyber War, the Next Threat to National Security. His newest novel, Pinnacle Event, was released about 2 years ago, and they're gripping reads, but they're also books that help us see the challenges we face in the cybersecurity and terrorism environment. I could spend the next 10 minutes telling you all of the advisory boards and councils he serves on, but know that he has the ear of Washington and the global community when it comes to issues of terrorism and countering violent extremism. Dick, we are delighted to have such a leading expert here, and particularly a leading expert who is a longtime friend of Penn and who traces his roots back to the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome back to Penn, and welcome to Perry World House.
Thank you very much. I must say that this is a marked improvement on the parking lot that was here when I attended. So congratulations for building this marvelous facility. The point of this meeting today is to get you to read the volume of the Annals. And I urge you all, if you're interested in this subject enough to come here, then be interested enough to read the volume. There are some of the nations and some of the world's best experts on terrorism and countering violent extremism have contributed to that volume, and my role, as it was 8 years ago, was to corral the authors and make sure that there was a theme to the pudding. 8 years ago, when the Academy asked me to put together a volume to brief the President, we didn't know when we wrote it who the President would be. It didn't really matter. But if you look at that volume, 8 years ago, I think it's marked by two things. One, it was about fighting terrorism. It focused on techniques to counter terrorism, anti-terrorism activities both in the United States and abroad. So it was much more in the post-9/11 combat terrorism mode. The second thing that's striking about it is that half of the authors then went into the Obama administration and implemented that volume, beginning with the CIA director. This year's volume is different in many respects because I think the problem has evolved and our understanding of the problem has evolved. This year, we divided the volume into two distinctly different topic areas. It's a Venn diagram, they're overlapping, but the two distinctly different areas are, number one, countering violent extremism. And that section of the volume was edited by Rand Beers, my colleague, for many years in government, who for a while ran the Department of Homeland Security. So he knows of what he speaks. The second half of the volume focused on failed states in the Middle East and in the area around the Middle East. And that half of the volume was edited by Paul Salem, who is the Director of Studies at the Middle East Institute. Just for truth in advertising, I'm the chairman of the Middle East Institute, and we got a lot of help from the Institute in drafting that half of the volume. And I would encourage you who aren't familiar with the Middle East Institute to visit its website, mei.edu. The Middle East Institute is a 70-year-old think tank. There are lots of think tanks these days, but none of them can say that, focusing on U.S. relations with the Middle East. The second thing that's different about the volume this year as opposed to 8 years ago is I don't think anybody in the list of authors are going to go into the Trump administration. And that, I think, may reflect the nature of the problem as we identified it in the volume and how our understanding of the problems, the two distinct problems, differs considerably, I think, from what the Trump administration seems to be doing. In other words, they haven't read it. Or if they did, they certainly disagree with it. The thrust of the countering violent extremism half of the volume is that the best way to stop terrorist attacks in places like the United States and in Western Europe is to have the Islamic community within our countries feel like they're at home, feel like they are a part of the country. The volume talks about a lot of the programs that have been tried in places like England and in some places in the United States to build better community relations in urban environments, typically in urban environments. The best example we have so far is the program in Montgomery County in Maryland that makes ties between members of the Islamic community and the government at the county level to make sure that there's adequate social services, adequate programming for that community, adequate participation in the civic life of the community by those in the Islamic community. And as part of that, make sure that there is friendly and cooperative relations between the local police and the mosques. Not so that people will turn in possible terrorists, but so that there will be a sense of joint enterprise, so that there will be a sense that creating a secure environment is in everyone's interest. There's been some success elsewhere in the country, and there's been some success in England, limited, but nonetheless. But the major thrust of that half of the volume, to put it in a nutshell, is we need programs for countering violent extremism, rather than just programs of surveillance and domestic espionage to identify terrorists. Because, as the volume tries to point out, it's impossible through surveillance, no matter how intrusive, no matter how violative of civil rights and civil liberties, it's impossible for surveillance to know when someone goes from being radicalized, and by the way, the definition of being radicalized is simply that you go to certain websites associated with radical groups, which a lot of us who study the radical groups do, so maybe I'm radicalized. But the definition is to move from being radicalized, simply reading about the views of these terrorist-associated groups, to being a terrorist. That movement, that flip of the switch, takes about 5 minutes. One day, someone is sitting alone in his bedroom. I say his because it's almost typically men. Sitting alone in his bedroom, reading one of these websites, which have very effective propaganda, far more effective than ours in countering it. And the next minute they've decided they've had enough, and they start thinking about how to go and do violence, and usually how to commit suicide in the process. No surveillance system can know when that switch is flipped. No security system can handle that. So rather than focusing just on surveillance, rather than focusing just on identifying potential terrorists in advance and arresting them before they do anything, the volume suggests that the need is to counter the message that they're getting in those websites. Counter the message that they're getting from radical sources in the Middle East or radical sources here in the United States. And to have a dialogue, to take the arguments apart that Al-Qaeda and ISIS make, to have members of their own community do that. It doesn't make a lot of sense for someone who is not a Muslim to be debating the Quran with someone who is. What's most powerful is having true Muslim scholars taking apart the arguments of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and showing that they are not what the Prophet Muhammad was talking about. They are not what the Quran teaches. I can't do that, but Muslim scholars can. That's what countering violent extremism is about. And we think, in addition to doing the surveillance programs, which have a role, the most effective way to deal with threats in Western societies is to have that kind of open dialogue, community relations, and exposure of the fallacies of the reasoning and the fallacies of the theology of organizations like Daesh and Al-Qaeda. The second half of the volume is about failed states. And while there's a relationship between countering violent extremism and failed states in the Middle East are a specific and distinct problem from the messaging on terrorism. We now have, depending upon your count, 6 or 7 nations in the Middle East that have failed, that have collapsed, where the central government, if there is a central government, does not provide control or security or social services throughout the country, where large swaths of the country are in fact under the control of armed insurgencies, which happen to be terrorist groups. And that's Libya, still. It's Somalia. It's Iraq. It's Syria. It's parts of Pakistan. And it's Afghanistan and Yemen. Each of those countries collapsed for a different reason. Some of them have been in a collapsed state for decades, like Somalia. Some collapsed in the Arab Spring of 2011 and 2012. What the volume tries to suggest is a solution that has to be crafted uniquely for each one of those countries. That there is no one cookie-cutter solution that fits all to get those countries back in shape. But what it does suggest is as long as these countries have failed central governments, as long as there are large swaths of territory that are under the control of terrorist groups, that those areas pose a threat, not only to the areas that are still controlled by the government, but to Western Europe and the United States. If there was a lesson that we should have learned from 9/11, it was the lesson about Afghanistan. The lesson that if you allow a terrorist group to control large swaths of territory in a nation and have training camps and recruit people from around the world to go to those training camps, that they will then dispatch terrorists from those territories to do attacks elsewhere. That's what happened to us on 9/11, and that is what's been happening in Western Europe and other parts of the Middle East based on these territories. Now, having said that, the volume makes a very clear point that taking back control of those ungoverned territories, particularly taking back control of the urban areas. By the way, this is the first time a terrorist group has run cities, multiple cities in multiple countries. ISIS, or Daesh, as I like to call it, and most people in the Middle East call it, Daesh, they hate being called Daesh, which is why we call them Daesh. Daesh controlled large cities, Sitra in Libya, Mosul in Iraq, among other cities in Iraq, Raqqa, which it still controls in Syria. This is the first time that we saw that phenomenon of holding territory. And that is something that makes Daesh unique from past terrorist groups. It also makes them vulnerable, as they have now learned. When the opposition finally gets its act together, they know where to find them. For a counter-terrorist, half of the problem has always been finding the terrorists. When they control large swaths of territory in cities, you kind of know where they are, and you kind of know where to attack them. And so thousands of members of Daesh have been killed just in the last year alone, defending these cities and defending territory. But the message that we try to impart in the volume is, do not think that when those cities fall to the control of central governments, do not think that when the ungoverned territory becomes governed to a degree, that the problem is solved. It's not. And I'm afraid that the media, of which I'm a part sometimes, and the governments are looking as a measure of success, as a measure of defeating ISIS, are looking at when Mosul will completely be under the control of the Baghdad government, and which will probably be in a month or two, and then when Raqqa will fall later in the spring. Sitra has already fallen in Libya. When that happens, ISIS is not dead. ISIS will then be what Al-Qaeda has always been, a powerfully influential terrorist group with a lot of money and a lot of savvy about how to conduct terrorist operations, how to recruit people, how to promote its ideology. It just won't be doing it from fixed geographic locations. So the ISIS threat will not have gone away. Which brings us back full circle to the first half of the volume. Because ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and I should say that we make a point in the volume, we have not defeated al-Qaeda. And in many ways, al-Qaeda is stronger than it's been in the last 10 years. Those organizations will continue to exist, and we have to defeat them, as the 9/11 Commission said, with the battle of ideas. The battle of ideas, which we now call messaging and countering violent extremism. So that's a summary of what the volume says. It is a very inadequate summary. I really do urge you to go online or get the hard copy of the volume and take a look at the details that our authors have presented. The sad conclusion we have, I think most of us as authors in the volume, is that the administration is doing the exact opposite of what we suggest. That rather than countering violent extremism through its messaging, it's in fact stoking the fires by sending out a message that is exactly the same message as al-Qaeda and Daesh have been delivering for years. And their message, which is now the Trump administration's implicit message, is that America is at war with Islam. Barack Obama went out of his way repeatedly to say explicitly and in these words, America is not at war with Islam. Prior to that, George W. Bush said that repeatedly, in part because I wrote it for him. But he read it, and I think he meant it. That is not the message that the United States government is now transmitting to the world. And until and unless we correct that message, our counterterrorism efforts will consist of killing people. And as we've discovered for the last 15 years or 20 years, you can kill terrorists all day long, and there will still be more of them, unless you solve the ideological underpinnings and the socioeconomic and political underpinnings that have caused them to be terrorists. If the society continues to be one that generates terrorists because it's unjust, because there are no opportunities, because the governance system is closed, because the government system is repressive, those kind of nations will continue to produce terrorists. We have been fighting in Afghanistan now for 16 years. That's the longest war in American history. Americans are dying there still. You don't see it in the newspapers, but they are. And they're dying now as well in Iraq again. We've been doing this for 16 years. If we want to do it for another 16 years, then we continue to transmit the message that America is at war with Islam. If we want to end this long battle and bring our troops home and actually see peace in some of these countries, then in addition to killing people, we have to get at the root causes, the socioeconomic causes, the political causes, and the ideological causes. So with that, let me turn the table back over to you. We look forward to your questions in a few moments.
Thank you. Thank you, Dick, for those very thoughtful remarks and what an important moment for you to be able to share them with us in the sort of broader scope of America's foreign policy. I'm now going to invite Malcolm Nance to the stage. Malcolm was a career counterterrorism and intelligence officer for the U.S. government, special operations, homeland security, and intelligence agencies. He has over 33 years of experience in combating radical extremism. I don't think he can tell us about all of those years, but he is now an honorably retired U.S. Navy Arabic-speaking intelligence collections operator, field interrogator, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape specialist, and the founder of the Advanced Terrorism, Abduction, and Hostage Survival School. He spent more than 2 decades on clandestine anti-terrorism and counterterrorism intelligence operations around the world. And on the morning of 9/11, he witnessed the attack on the Pentagon firsthand and became a first responder at the crash site. He is a fierce champion of ethics, human rights, and cultural integration in intelligence practitioners and activities. He's trained and advised countless intelligence analysts, and I can think of no one better to engage with Dick in a conversation about the challenges of countering violent extremism in the age of the Trump presidency. Malcolm, do you care to join us on the stage and kick off the discussion? Thanks so much.
Whoops. Well, this will be interesting. First, excuse me. It was a brilliant introduction. Everybody else knows me from MSNBC. But I'm very honored to be on the stage with you here today, Dick. As a field practitioner, I never very often got to meet the head shed and the decision makers. So fascinating to have that. And I have a series of questions, which I've taken, some of them are extrapolated from the Annals itself. And if you haven't read the volume of the Annals, it's brilliant work. I'm only jealous that I wasn't included in that, but maybe next time, next administration. So with that, I want to talk about, of course, the Trump administration and countering violent extremism and combating terrorism. The Trump administration brings to the table a very unique, some would say disruptive perspective towards the Middle East, South Asia region with regards to terrorism and countering violent extremism, CVE. In fact, there is actually a mythology that appears to have been created around the origins and structures of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So I want to start off the discussion on that, then move on to the stability of failed states, Israel, Palestine, Iran, and if you don't mind, a little touch on cyber, which, as we know, you were the first expert in the United States government. So, question number one. In the first articles of the Annal, Paul Salem correctly identified the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the Arab uprisings in 2011 as having been the driving contributors to the rise of ISIS and the expansion and sustainment of Al-Qaeda in the Trans-Sahel region. Can you identify, were there any specific U.S. policies during the Obama administration which may have helped exacerbate the rise of these groups?
Well, I think what Paul Salem says, and I think it's hard to argue with, is that if the United States had never invaded Iraq, there wouldn't be an ISIS. I think it's interesting. You can't reverse history. You can't go back and not invade Iraq. But it is worth considering when you think about the origin of the problem. Yeah. How did that problem come into existence? It came into existence because the United States government needlessly, I think, invaded Iraq and caused the chaos out of which ISIS grew. Now, there's an argument to be made, and I'm not sure I agree with it, but there's an argument to be made in answer to your question. The Obama administration decided to get out of Iraq as fast as it could. There's an argument made by Republicans, largely, that was too swift. That if we had stayed there longer, perhaps ISIS wouldn't have grown up. It's worth pointing out, in opposition to that belief, that the legitimate government of Iraq, the elected government of Iraq, told us to get the hell out. Yeah. And I suppose President Obama could have said no, but I don't know what legal basis he would have had to do that. The Obama administration certainly tried to negotiate with the Iraqi government to extend some small presence there. But whatever small remaining presence might have been to train and equip the Iraqi army, I don't think that would have stopped the rise of ISIS at all. So I'm not sure that there's anything that the Obama administration could have done. There was a point in 2012 when members of the Obama cabinet recommended to the president a more active program in Syria to back a faction in Syria against the Assad government. And that faction is variously described as moderate, or I don't know if there are any Syrian fighters who are moderate, but at least they were not ISIS. They were not Daesh. Right. President Obama, and this we can debate historically, I think, for years. President Obama decided, against the advice of his cabinet members, that aiding that group in Syria would not help. That group, he thought, wouldn't be able to be trained as a military force and wouldn't be able to stand up against Daesh. He also had a philosophy, which he's admitted to, that the United States tends to break things in the Middle East whenever we get involved, that our involvement tends to be unhelpful. However well-intentioned our involvement might be, we usually leave things worse off than they were before. I disagree with that, but I think that was the president's philosophy. So could he have done more? Yes. He could have, in 2012, done what the Secretary of State at the time, who was Hillary something, recommended, and the Secretary of Defense recommended, and provide assistance to that other group.
Okay. And now that you've brought that point up about President Obama's policy in Syria, and here's a question I've been wondering for a very long time. When the Syrians employed chemical weapons, particularly outside of the Damascus suburbs, President Obama drew a red line on the usage of chemical weapons in urban areas. Should the president have taken that last step? I mean, should he have ignored Congress, going on for, I believe the strategic plan at the time was to take away the Syrian Air Force as a strategic tool so that the nation wouldn't have, would have an imbalance against Israel. Do you think he should have done that?
Let me answer in a more generic sense.
Okay.
I've always been taught in government that in international affairs that you don't make threats that you don't carry out. That the credibility of a nation like the United States is vital. The credibility of the country, when it says something, is vital to its soft power, to its ability to achieve things without military involvement. If you threaten, the red line was before they used chemical weapons. If you have the President of the United States say explicitly, if you use chemical weapons, we will eliminate them, and then they clearly use chemical weapons against civilian populations in violation of all sorts of international law, and then you have a great buildup where everybody thinks that you're about to do something. I mean, the military were literally putting bombs on airplanes, about, planning to take off the next morning. And then you say, oh, no, I changed my mind. There's a problem there. Now, Obama's answer to that is, look, I got a better deal. I negotiated, didn't use force. I got the result I wanted without the use of force. With the help of Russia, I got a deal where the Syrians voluntarily gave up all of their chemical weapons, and they were destroyed or moved out of the country. That's true. And if all you're thinking about is the continued use of chemical weapons against civilians, then he did solve that problem. But I think he solved that problem at the cost of American credibility. I think it's very important when the President of the United States says, if you do this, I will do that you have to carry through.
Okay. Well, let me bring this down from that high-altitude strategic level down to something a little more tactical, because that's where I come from. It's been 15 years since 9/11, and it appears that a lot of U.S. foreign policy is being driven not on large-scale attacks like we saw 9/11 or Brussels, but on small individual incidents, such as Paris, Bataclan, the attacks in San Bernardino and Orlando. Right. Are we at the point where any individual terrorist attack now is going to make a very broad change in our policy, as we're seeing with the Trump administration?
Any terrorist attack in this country or in Western Europe gets a lot of press attention. Terrorist attacks in Pakistan, that kill many more people, terrorist attacks in Iraq and Turkey that kill many more people, barely get into our media. But if people are killed in Paris or London or Madrid or California, all the media stops and focuses just on that attack. And the attack can be one person or two people. San Bernardino, the Boston Marathon bombing, other attacks in the United States were one or two people who had remote connection to ISIS or Al-Qaeda. They were these people I'm talking about who were sitting there watching things on their computer, and the switch flipped and they said, okay, I've had enough, I'm going to go out and do something about it. And they then become suicide attackers. Any loss of life to terrorists is something we want to prevent. And we don't want to say that there is some minimal number of loss of life that's acceptable. It's not. We want to eliminate all terrorist attacks. But it would be good if we put it in perspective. It would be good if we realized that most things that fit the definition of terrorist attacks in the United States in the last 25 years were carried out by people not who identified as Muslim, but who identified as Christian. And most of the terrorist attacks in the United States in the last 25 years were carried out by white guys who were born in the United States, overwhelmingly. So it would be nice if the media explained that instead of just obsessing about a terrorist attack that involves Muslims. It would also be nice if, as a matter of policy, we took into account the real cost of those attacks in the United States versus other problems. I'm not saying we should tolerate terrorist attacks or there's any acceptable level of terrorist attacks. There isn't. And if we can stop them, we should. But we do need to put the terrorist problem that we have here in this country in perspective. Because of a lot of improvement in domestic law enforcement and intelligence sharing and other programs, we have not had a major terrorist attack on the scale of 9/11 or anything approaching that since 9/11. And that, I think, is something that we should take some satisfaction from. It's not to say it won't ever happen again, because in the nature of the global society and the nature of modern societies, we're fragile. It's really easy to do those attacks, and it's really difficult to stop them. It costs very little to do them, and it costs an enormous amount to prevent them.
Well, I agree with you 100% there. And that being said, let's take a hypothetical scenario. Let's say, what do you suppose the Trump administration's response would be to even a small-scale attack like the Chattanooga Marine Corps recruiting center shooting, as opposed to an Orlando shooting where you have mass casualty, 50 dead? Do you think that there's going to be any proportionality, or do you think it's going to be interesting?
That's a question, Malcolm, I think that a lot of us in this business have been asking each other and ourselves. If there is a terrorist attack in the United States of some small magnitude, but nonetheless a significant attack, what is this president likely to do? It's hard to imagine what that answer is, frankly. In part because it's hard to know what he's ever going to do on anything. But when you think about what we're already doing against ISIS and Daesh, I don't know how you ramp that up. In the last month, last 2 weeks really, little noticed in the United States, we have sent the Marines into Syria, and we have sent Army Rangers into Syria. And there's apparently an element of the 82nd Airborne about to move into Syria. Syria. This is the first time we're used to Americans fighting in Iraq. We're used to Americans fighting in Afghanistan. And we have this whole long history of the last 16 years. We've never had Americans fighting in Syria before. And without a lot of public discussion or public debate or public explanation, really, we've sent troops into Syria in the last 2 weeks, and we're about to send more in. That may be the right thing to do, to just end the occupation of these cities by ISIS. But it would be nice if we had some public discussion and public explanation.
Sure.
And we don't have that. I don't know how you ramp that up beyond what he's already doing.
Right.
So if there's an ISIS-related terrorist attack here in the United States and the president wants to do more to go after ISIS, I don't know what more you can do.
Well, since you jumped all the way to question 14 with the forces flowing into Syria, let's move on with that, because we, as a warfighter, I'm seeing the moves that are being made. The 18th Airborne Corps Forward headquarters is moved to Kuwait. 1,000 airborne troops have moved to Kuwait for deployment to Syria.
Yep.
The Marine MEU afloat is moving in there as well. Not to mention the regular 500 Special Forces and 100 new Rangers. Is this a ground combat element that is preparing for a ground war as a component of the Kurdish Free Syrian Army elements that are maybe doing a direct offensive on Raqqa? Are we in a new war?
Well, candidate Trump said that he would eliminate ISIS in 30 days after he became president. I think today is day 52.
2 years of softening up, too. Right?
He also said that he would have, that he had a secret plan to end Daesh or ISIS. And then later he said he would, as soon as he became president, he would ask the military for a plan. So he has a secret plan and he's going to ask the military for it. Maybe he has a plan and he's implementing it. Maybe that's what's going on. We are clearly seeing U.S. troops, as you outlined, move into Syria, and more staging to move into Syria. And I don't know what the plan is. The President of the United States has never told us. The President of the United States actually hasn't even said that he's done it.
Right.
I think I have great faith in Secretary Mattis. I have great faith in the National Security Advisor, the new one, General McMaster. They are very good people. They understand this problem as well as anybody. They have been in the Middle East for a very long time, personally fighting and leading troops, and working with our Arab coalition colleagues. So I trust them to come up with a good plan. But there's a political process issue here. This is a democracy.
Right.
Allegedly. And wouldn't it be nice if somewhere along the line the president told us what he's doing?
Right.
After 9/11, the Congress passed the resolution to authorize the use of military force. Authorized use of military force, AUMF is the acronym. And we are still operating all this time later on that resolution that was passed in September of 2001. Right. President Obama asked the Congress to give him a new authorization, to delimit our goals and objectives and say what he can do with military force in the Middle East. That's the first time, by the way, that I recall a president asking Congress to authorize the use of military force and limit him. You would have thought, with the president volunteering to do that, that the Congress would say yes and do it. The Congress totally ignored the request, except for Senator Tim Kaine from Virginia and a few others. I think the time is now for the Congress again to say, we want to know what your plan is and we want to authorize it.
Okay. Well, if I can follow up on that, I believe in the last 2 days a new authorization for the use of military force for Iraq and Syria is being introduced as legislation. And if you would like to know his plan, Donald Trump told Time magazine the last book he read was my book, Defeating ISIS. which has a plan
I
in
didn't
the
know he
last
read books.
chapter with maps, and it called for a ground invasion of Syria. So maybe he is implementing that plan.
It'd be nice of him to tell us.
I don't know about that part. So let me move on back to the subject of failed states. Mark Lynch wrote extensively about the need for continued stability measures in failed states, and I thought it was excellent. What do you perceive will be the Trump administration's approach towards Syria with regards to its belief that Russia must be the lead partner in the defeating of ISIS? And by extension, is Trump ensuring the survival of the Assad regime, and doesn't only Russia and Iran benefit from this?
And you know, there's so many moving pieces in the Syrian equation, and they all relate to something else. The poor Syrian people are the pawns of Iran, Russia, the United States, Israel. It's very, very hard to imagine a negotiated settlement in Syria that allows President Assad to continue in office. After all the war crimes that he has ordered, after all the destruction of cities, and the bombing of civilians, the bombing of hospitals that he has ordered, I cannot imagine the Syrian opposition forces ever signing a peace agreement with him. I just can't imagine that. Now, the Russians signaled to Secretary Kerry several times in the last year of the Obama administration that they were not wedded to President Assad, that they wanted the group that he represents and the regime to be preserved, but they weren't wedded to him. So it's conceivable that there might be, if everybody really were of goodwill and wanted a negotiated settlement, you might be able to negotiate a settlement. Mm-hmm. But the unknown here, for those of us who are trying to figure out what's going on, is what's the deal between Trump and the Russians? Because that's one of those exogenous variables here. For us to get a settlement now in Syria, we need to get the Russians on board because they have troops there, and they are the ones who have saved Assad, the ones who are propping up Assad, along with Iran. But mainly, the thing that's made the difference is the Russian involvement. And so you have to negotiate with Russia to solve this problem. And separately from the Syria question, the president seems to have something going on with Russia. And I think whatever that is may influence U.S. policy towards Syria.
Right. Well, this still leads to many of the pillars that are holding up the Assad regime remaining in place. I mean, you have Russia, you have Assad's new regenerated combat power on the street, and then you have the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and Iraqi Shia militias fighting on the side of Assad. Now, if the U.S. has a great problem with the arc of the Shia crescent, that's Iran's projected power through Iraq, northern Syria, down into Lebanon, and Yemen, off to the side, then essentially is the Trump administration, by assisting Russia in what they believe is defeating ISIS, of which we've seen absolutely no evidence of, are they essentially propping up Iran's essential strategic power in the region by holding Assad up?
Well, if Assad and his government stay in power and stabilize and expand their power, that certainly is a victory for Iran. But if there's, this is why it's going to be fascinating to watch the evolution of American policy here. Because while that is true, it's also true if you look at the people who are shaping American policy. Now, Secretary Mattis and General McMaster, they are the most anti-Iranian people that you could name. And since they have been put in office, the message they have been sending to our Arab coalition partners is we wish we hadn't done the nuclear deal with Iran. We're not going to abandon it right now. But we are going to do everything in our power to counter Iranian aggression. throughout the Middle East. And we, the United States, are your partners. This is what they're saying to the Arab countries. It's what they said to the Deputy Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia this week when he was in the Oval Office. We are your partners in countering Iranian aggression and pushing it back. So I don't know. It could well be that Syria will turn out to be an exception to that, that they accept the Iranian role in Syria. But it's going to be interesting to see how they put meaning to the pledge that they're going to push back Iran in the Middle East.
Well, that's going to be fascinating. I know that coming into Iraq in 2003 and studying the Iraqi insurgent groups, I worked in and out of Iraq for over 10 years. And I wrote an entire volume of all of the terrorist groups in Iraq. And one thing was consistent about the groups who were operating in Anbar province, out in the north and the west. All of the suicide bombers, their logistics pipeline, their intelligence support pipeline, their manpower, personnel, and money were coming through Bashar al-Assad's Damascus and moving out to the Iraqi border and killing American soldiers.
Right. And this is the thing to understand about Mattis and McMaster. They lost friends, and they lost people working for them. U.S. soldiers were killed by Iran, in their view, in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And I think they want revenge. And maybe that's right, and maybe it's wrong, but it is something to keep in mind when you see them develop policy on these issues. There's an element of revenge here for the death of American troops at the hands of the Iranian IEDs and the Iranian-backed militias in Iraq, but also in Afghanistan.
Yeah, we had a lot more, 4,493 combat deaths from the people who were supported by the Bashar al-Assad regime through al-Qaeda suicide bombers and all the rest flowing over across the Syrian-Iraq border. How are they going to, I mean, Iran was culpable, you're right, in having the explosively formed IEDs down in Basra and Nasiriyah and all those areas. Sorry, we're getting technical. But that's a fascinating point, and I hadn't given that any thought. And with that, I will go on to Iran, because what's better than talking about a potential Iranian war? Never watch me before you go to sleep. That's the rule at NBC News. Okay. I'd like to touch on the Iran nuclear deal. And as you said, General McMaster, General Mattis, both war fighters, people who have had to deal with them. I've actually fought Iran 3 times. In 1988, just on a personal note, I fought in the Battle of Syria Island. I was in Beirut in 1983 for the Marine barracks bombing, which was helped by Iranian intelligence. And I was IED'd and rocketed by Iranian Shia militias in southern Iraq. So I have an interesting perspective on that. But one thing that I do believe is safeguarding this nation right now is the Iran nuclear deal. I was briefed on by the exact same briefer that the CIA briefer who gave the president his briefing. If they tear up this deal or step away from the Iran nuclear deal, are we in a situation where Iran could reconstitute back to a weaponized system their weapons program that they've so far appear to have dismantled?
Now, let's just set the baseline here on the Iranian nuclear deal. Iran had made nuclear weapon grade enriched uranium necessary for nuclear weapons. They'd made it with centrifuges. We attacked those centrifuges with a cyber attack in Stuxnet, the so-called Stuxnet attack. That delayed them, but they continued, and they made enough nuclear material to make a number of bombs. The agreement that Secretary Kerry and Secretary Moniz worked out called on Iran to eliminate 90% of that enriched material, and they have. So when you think about the accomplishments of the Obama administration, remember that when that administration started, we all expected that we would go to war with Iran to stop their nuclear program. Everybody thought that either Israel or the United States, or Israel and the United States, would end up bombing Iran to stop the nuclear program. That didn't happen. Through the use of diplomatic negotiations, through the use of economic sanctions, where Secretary Clinton was chief among the people who got them. The economic sanctions drove Iran to the negotiating table and drove them to an agreement whereby they voluntarily, if you call that voluntary, gave up 90% of the material that we know about. Now, it's possible that they're cheating. It's possible that they have some secret program in a cave somewhere. There's been no evidence of that. And there is an intrusive inspection regime as part of the agreement by the UN, by the IAEA, to see if there's cheating. Okay. So they've eliminated their nuclear program, or at least their enriched uranium. Could they do it again? Sure. They were about 6 months away from having a nuclear bomb when the agreement was signed. They are now at least a couple of years away if they wanted to start it again. So I think that's a good deal. I think that's an excellent deal. No war, they give up the material, we get to inspect, and we'll see a long lead time if they try to build nuclear weapons again. Having said all of that good news, there are people in both the United States and in Iran who don't like the agreement. The people in Iran who don't like the agreement are the Revolutionary Guards, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. As you know, the IRGC is a parallel military. So there's sort of like a political party that has its own army, its own navy. They're a little bit of a mix between what in the US we'd call special forces and a paramilitary force. But they're out there in the Persian Gulf, in the Arab Gulf, every day with their little boats, harassing the US Navy. Now, if you were the commander of the IRGC and you wanted to restart the nuclear program, what you might do is instigate a little incident with the US Navy where there's some shooting back and forth between their little boats and our destroyers. And that might provoke the President of the United States to do something rash and perhaps bomb Iran. Now, if that happened, if the President of the United States bombed Iran in response to some event that happened in the Gulf, that would be the end of the nuclear agreement, because the political forces in Iran would swing in a very nationalist way, and they would break the agreement, and we wouldn't be breaking it. They'd be breaking it. And they would begin again to enrich uranium. So I worry about that because the two forces there that could create that outcome are the IRGC, who clearly want something like that, I think, and the President of the United States, who might sort of, in a knee-jerk, irrational way, play right into their hands.
Well, on that note, I just moved back from 10 years in Abu Dhabi. And that little game of cat and mouse.
One of my favorite cities. Abu Dhabi's a great place. You should go there.
Beverly Hills of the Middle East.
It's beautiful. I was there last week.
So that being said, and this will be one of our final questions, if it does escalate to that point, because attacking small boats, chasing small boats was a full-time job in my career in the Persian Gulf. But if it gets to the point where they decide to go back, the deal is torn up, there's only one potential way, there's only one real way for the United States or Israel to really hit Iran that will stop that program. That's to burn it out, as we like to say, with an atomic weapon.
You're not going to do that.
No. Okay. That was my question. Is there any possibility with this administration that they could just decide that they will just resolve the issue in one fell swoop?
Well, I don't think you can. For over 20 years, I've looked at simulations and military war games about what a war with the United States and Iran would look like. And it hasn't changed a lot over the course of those 20 years. There's no winner. There can be combat in which there is no winner. We like to think of decisive victory and all of that. Actually, that's rare, I think, in military history. If the United States and Iran stumble into a war, we both lose. And places like Abu Dhabi and Dubai get destroyed in the process.
That's why I gave it a lot of thought.
I think it's when we talk about stumbling into a war with Iran because somebody provokes us in the Gulf, we have to be very careful to understand where the dominoes fall and how they fall. And it's not a good scenario. I think history will look back on the Iranian nuclear deal as a major diplomatic accomplishment in the ranks of major diplomatic accomplishments the United States has ever done.
Well, for my final question, and of course it's benign and not important at all, is the potential of the United States moving its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem a red line for our Arab allies for their continued support of the United States?
No, it's not. But it's also a needless thing to do. It will make it much more difficult for our Arab allies to support us. Not impossible. It depends on the Arab ally, which one you're talking about. But it'll, take King Abdullah in Jordan. It will make it very difficult for him to continue cooperation with the United States if we do something that it addresses the status of the holy city of Jerusalem outside of a comprehensive peace agreement. Every administration in the United States, Republican or Democrat, for 40 years has said that the status of Jerusalem has to be part of a final status arrangement between Palestine and Israel. And for the United States to move its embassy, you think, well, so what? It doesn't matter where our embassy is. It does, because it is a symbolic move that says that we've decided on the status of Al-Quds, of Jerusalem. And that, taken together with the signs coming out of the administration that they're no longer necessarily supporting a two-state solution, that would set off another intifada in Palestine and set back our relations with the region, set back the prospect for ever negotiating a peace between Palestine and Israel.
Well, great. Thank you very much for answering those questions. I appreciate it. And now it's time for questions from the audience.
And now for the tough question.
Yeah, I like those. So, who's first? There's a microphone over here. So, this gentleman up front, and then we'll work our way back.
If I could ask you to go back to where you began, which was a lot of emphasis on the ideological battle. If we work on the assumption that the Trump phenomenon came from somewhere, there are trends in the world, there are trends in Europe. In fact, just the other day or even yesterday, Holland had an election which was reassuring in some ways, but the way the more moderate candidate won was moving more in the direction of the more extreme candidate in terms of attitudes towards Islam. There's a movement in the world that's generically anti-pluralist, which gets to the whole question of anti-Islam versus something else. Can you talk a little bit about any movements, possibilities, what has actually happened, not in terms of America saying we're not anti-Islam, but in terms of the role of moderate and those scholars who need to get into a debate with the extremists? What about those countries? What about those scholars and their international role?
Yeah.
What has happened? What is the hope for that? Because even under Obama, that was probably more important in the long run than Obama not conveying that he was anti-Islam.
Right. So I think one lesson the State Department learned over the course of the last 10 years is that in terms of messaging to the Arab world, in terms of countering violent extremism by messaging, that is not something that the United States government should do, because it's not good at it. And in addition to not being good at it, it's not particularly credible to the audience that we're trying to message to. So having the State Department put up websites and having the State Department put up little videos and blogs and things. That's not going to help in any way. The counter messaging has to, in the Arab world, has to come from people living there in the Arab world. And while it does not get a lot of attention in Western media, that is happening. You know, we talk about Abu Dhabi, which I was in last week, and there's a center there, a center created, an international center created by the UAE government for countering violent extremism.
Hidayah?
Hidayah.
Yeah.
And if you look at the messages that are in Friday prayers at the mosques, there is now a process in the UAE to ensure that there are no violent extremist messages delivered in the sermons in the mosques. You know, that's true in country after country now, that there are imams, there are Quranic scholars who are getting the message out. They're not getting it out in things that we read. You know, they're getting it out in Arabic, on Arab TV, in Arabic newspapers. That is happening. And it's far more successful than if we did it.
Next question. In the middle here.
Would you feel more comfortable militarily with President Pence when Trump gets impeached?
Well, as we like to say, there are some assumptions built into the question. I don't know a thing about Mike Pence's views on any of these issues. So I really can't say. But, you know, impeachment is not the subject of today's discussion. But I do have to say, don't get your hopes up. I think, you know, in the long history of the United States, 2 presidents have been impeached, and neither one of them were removed. And while there may be some treasure trove of damning evidence out there, it would be extraordinary if that were the case. Extraordinary things happen all the time. But I don't think we should assume that that is the future.
Good point. Over here, up front.
I have a question about, you talk about
No need for a mic.
Secretary of Defense. You talk about the Secretary of Defense, General Mattis, and I have confidence in him too, and I hope he doesn't resign. You also talk about General McMaster. You haven't most notably talked about Secretary Tillerson. You did talk about Secretary Kerry, and the really seminal role he played in the Iran deal. I don't see Secretary Tillerson playing the same kind of role, and I wonder what you thought about that and what that means to our foreign policy.
Well, let me admit up front, I worked for the Department of State for 20 years. So I'm a little bit prejudiced. I happen to think that the Department of State, for all the, the bad press it gets, is a real gem. And one of the great American institutions is the Foreign Service. This whole argument about soft power versus hard power and the Pentagon versus the State Department is artificial. If you talk to career Foreign Service officers and you talk to career military officers, they do not see themselves in competition. They see themselves as on the same team, and they will tell you that they can't win without the other. There's a long list of American generals and admirals who said before you give another dollar to the Pentagon, you have to increase the State Department budget. General Mattis said that. Secretary now Mattis said that. Secretary Bob Gates said that. Secretary Bob Gates actually went to the Congress to give testimony to increase the State Department budget when he was the Secretary of Defense. That's because the State Department is not this sort of 19th century bunch of diplomats in pinstripe suits pushing cookies across the table. The average Foreign Service officer is out there in boots with mud on them, finding counter-narcotics people in Latin America, going after weapons of mass destruction, proliferators, and helping in violent extremism and counterinsurgency programs. They're on the front lines, and they get killed too. And they live under extraordinarily bad conditions in some of these places. The State Department budget that the President introduced today, he proposes to cut the existing State Department budget by 28%. There is nothing in my mind that you could do to unilaterally disarm the United States more effectively than cutting a quarter of the State Department budget.
Good question. This gentleman right here? You.
Good evening, Mr. Clarke. At the very beginning, I think, if I'm not mistaken, you said that it takes 5 minutes for a radical person to change his mind and become a terrorist. I think you are so wrong. Why? 2 examples. Myself, I am radical and I'm Muslim. But you cannot say I'm radical Muslim, and it doesn't take me 5 minutes to change my mind and become a terrorist. I'm radical because I'm a mathematician. For me, things are right and wrong. In mathematics, I learned that you could find the difference between what is right and what is wrong. Not to mention in mathematics, I learned something, they call it the solvability. In very intricate problem, there is something they call it solvability. If we cannot solve it, we can address if it's solvable, at least, or not solvable. So if it's not solvable, we don't waste our time. That's why I am radical. On the other hand, because of with that radical character, I approach Islam, and I know what is right. So the second example is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, at the very beginning, he grew up in Kuwait, in a country that he doesn't belong. He cannot even become a Kuwaiti citizen. He lived in the fringe of the society, while he belonged to a poor country, they call it Pakistan, poor community in Pakistan. He even belonged to a minority in the Muslim Sunni. Now, he moved to the United States, and he came to study engineering in
Could you
Yes.
just get to the question?
Here is
Other
the thing.
people want to
Here's
ask
the question now.
Sure,
Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, he studied Christianity in college while he was studying engineering. Now, I thought he was studying,
The question.
Yes, sir. I thought he was studying Blessed the Peacemaker and Turn Your Cheek and all this. I did my research in the Christianity that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed studied. It was literally what we call it liberal theology. It is the theology. It is the Christianity that turn you an activist. Now multiplied by 10.
Please, the question.
The question, sir, it doesn't take 5 minutes for a radical to become a terrorist.
كم 10 سنوات 5 سنوات كم How many years?
I think what I was trying to say was it's impossible through surveillance for law enforcement authorities or intelligence authorities to know when someone who they know is radical, to know when that person has gone from being radical to being someone who is about to commit a terrorist attack.
Yeah.
That was my point.
If I could just touch on that point really quick. In the intelligence side, we have a more accurate term where you go from being ideologically extreme to weaponizing, to where your ideology has moved on beyond ideology and you go on to action. So yeah, you're right, more than 5 minutes. Alhamdulillah, subhanallah. Okay, in the back there, the glasses. They both have glasses? Universities.
First of all, I just want to thank both of you for your long service to the country. Mr. Nance, please keep up putting the pressure on this administration.
Yeah, thank my wife.
She did all the hard work. Thanks to her then. I spent a year in Iraq myself and Kirkuk. I became close with my Kurdish interpreters. I spent some time in Kurdish-controlled Iraq. My question for you, for both of you, is has the destabilization of Iraq and Syria made it any more likely that the Kurdish people may someday end up with their own country? And could that be a force for stabilization in and of itself? And should we be supporting that diplomatically in terms of our foreign policy for that state to come into existence as an independent state?
The United States has, in the past, as far back as Henry Kissinger, when he was Secretary of State, promised things to the Kurdish people and not delivered. Having said that, I think we need to understand that the Kurdish people, they're an ethnic group. They're an ethnic group in about 5 different countries. They cross the borders. There is no single political entity that is the Kurdish people. There are some Kurdish groups, as you know, that have the support of the government of Turkey. There are some Kurdish groups that are openly engaged in combat against Turkey. There are Kurds in Syria, there are Kurds in Iran, as well as in Iraq. I would like to see the Kurds move from the sort of semi-autonomous state that they've had since the Iraq War to full nation state status. That's a personal view, because I think they've demonstrated everything that you would want out of a nation state. They're semi-democratic for that region of the world. They're very democratic. They have been willing to fight and die, not only for their own territory, but for the stability of the region. And I think having a Kurdish state would be a good thing. The question is, how do you get there without the government in Baghdad and the government in Ankara going crazy? And I don't know the answer to that. If there is some grand bargain where the Turkish government and the Iraqi government could be persuaded to allow the peaceful secession of Iraqi Kurdistan, I think that would be a good thing. I don't know how to make that bargain.
Excellent point. One last, I'll give a quick comment to that. I spent a lot of time up in Kurdistan also, and you might notice that right now our forces are aligned with a Syrian Kurdish group, the SDF, operating up in the vicinity of Manbij, and are assisting them in the southern push towards northern Raqqa. So technically they're the good Kurds, and so are the Kurdish forces in Iraq, which are helping to the east of Mosul. Now, Turkey doesn't see it that way. Turkey sees groups like the YPG and the SDF as outliers and groups that could be armed to the point where they could carve out all of northern Syria, northeastern Syria, into their own safe haven, aligned with the Yazidis and the Iraqi Kurds. And they're deathly afraid of that, to the point where they did a short intervention against them. The question is, when this big offensive on Raqqa takes place, it appears that the majority of the forces are going to be Kurdish that take that city. And the Trump administration is talking about an eastern Iraq, Syrian safe haven. So it remains to be seen. That dream may come true, and then the Turks and the Iraqis may decide to end it on the same day. And I think it'll be fascinating to see how the Trump administration plays both sides, because we're going to go in there and we're going to take Raqqa with these guys and then abandon them to be slaughtered by the Turks. Well, we'll have a new dimension of terrorism I don't think we've ever planned on.
Yeah, no, I think that, again, it comes back to diplomacy and the role of diplomacy.
Yeah.
The only way to solve the nationalist desires of the Kurdish people is through a negotiated settlement. I don't know how you do that, however.
Yeah. Next question. Ma'am, up front.
Thank you for coming. شكرا
سمعك.
للإخوان.
Salamti.
مرحبا.
Ahlan sahlan.
So my question is, what do you think the U.S. could have done better when they invaded Iraq, especially in terms of countering
How about not invading?
terrorism? Yeah. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, there was no reason to invade Iraq. I mean, there was no good reason. There was no justifiable reason to invade Iraq. I know people who say, you know, we could have done it better. Well, of course we could have done it better. But, you know, that's arguing over doing something stupid, you know, doing it better. It's still something stupid. There was absolutely no justification. There were no weapons of mass destruction. Anybody who tells you that there was overwhelming evidence that there were weapons of mass destruction is wrong. There was not overwhelming evidence. The evidence was thin, and the intelligence community failed to do its job to advise the president. After the war, after the mess, there were commissions to look at what went wrong. And there was specifically a group tasked to look at what went wrong with the intelligence community. And one of the things they found was the intelligence community was asked a question: are there weapons of mass destruction? They looked at what the evidence was and said, well, based on this evidence, yes, there probably are. What they didn't do, and what they should have done, was say, is there adequate information to make that judgment? Not taking the information that we have. So what they did was they took the inadequate dregs of information that they had and looked at that and said, well, these dregs, these poor quality intelligence reports, suggest there are weapons of mass destruction. What they should have said was, we don't have any good intelligence reports. There weren't any. There were no good sourced intelligence reports that suggested there were weapons of mass destruction. So the intelligence community failed. And the President of the United States at the time might have done it anyway, because I think he came into office with the goal of invading Iraq and finishing what his father hadn't finished. At least that's the impression he gave me repeatedly. I think the United States is to blame for a lot of the disruption in the Middle East because we initiated that war. That was a war of choice, and it was a war without justification.
I agree with that 100%. I've said it numerous times. Invading Iraq after 9/11 would be like invading Mexico after Pearl Harbor. It just had absolutely nothing to do with it. And in the fall of 2002, I met Dr. Harman Ullman, who's Colin Powell's professor at the Army War College, the man who created the shock and awe doctrine. And he just asked me, he said, you're a senior enlisted, you know the Middle East, what do you think about this? I said, I just don't see it. I don't see the train of intelligence that leads me to weapons of mass destruction. And they go, well, they had it before, was their whole mindset. They had it before. Yeah, they had it before. But
they had it before, and then the United Nations went in and blew it up.
Yeah, and they didn't believe that. So, good question. Okay, way in the back there, right next to the microphone.
Hi, thanks for coming out to talk to us. And just one question. You divided up the Middle East between failed states and what else? Because when I look at the Middle East, I see not much good in any of the states. I mean, Turkey's veering off. They're not a reliable ally. I mean, I don't want to go into it, but Saudi Arabia generates a lot of animus to the West, and with its schooling and with the Wahhabis. Egypt just collapsed to a military dictatorship now again, where they had the Muslim Brotherhood, which wasn't great either. I mean, where are you looking for the bright spots?
The definition of failed state that
I understand that, but I'm saying, but it seems like there's like a continuum. There's no one bucket failed, then everything else is okay. No, right?
No, there are places in the Middle East, like the UAE, for example.
Yeah, but that's a tiny, tiny place. I'm talking about places with big populations: Iran, Turkey, Saudi, Egypt. I'm not saying Jordan even. I mean,
if your goal is to have democracies in the Middle East, that's not going to happen anytime soon.
No, that's a red herring. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about non-aggressive, countries that are not going to be aggressively trying to destabilize their neighbors. not going to be aggressively trying to destabilize, supporting underneath.
Well, so if the question is, are there governments in the Middle East that are not aggressive and not trying to destabilize? Yeah. Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt. You may not like the Egyptian government. I agree with you about President Sisi. But they're not aggressive. They're not trying to destabilize anything. That goes to the issue of democracy. But we are never going to like all of the governments in the Middle East. They're never going to look like us. They're never going to all agree with us. The question is, what is our minimum desired outcome for the Middle East? Minimum. And I think we tried to suggest in the Annals volume that our minimum desired outcome is that there be governments in all of those nations. Pardon me? Our minimum desired outcome is that there be governments in all of those states that control their own territory and do not allow the export of terrorism from those states. That's the minimum, and we haven't even achieved that. In fact, we're a long way from achieving that.
Let me just make a point, and then we'll wrap it up. I've spent 35 years in the Middle East, on and off. Most of my career working. I've fought in every country that you've mentioned, and a couple I shouldn't tell you. But for the most part, you know, when people ask me, they say, "Oh, the Middle East, it's failed, and what do people want over there?" And they just want to kill us. You know what? When I live on the street, and as a special operations and intelligence guy, field intelligence guys, I only lived with Muslims in my career. Go to mosque with them, pray with them, shoot the gun at their weddings. I know exactly what they want. Do you know what they want in the Middle East? 2017 Toyota Corolla, and to be left alone. And the problem is, we often go in and break the China. The invasion of Iraq, I think, was a seminal point, you know, almost right up there with the Balfour Declaration in terms of how we have reset the game. And all of the broken dominoes you're seeing now, many of them come directly from that, the rise of ISIS. There wasn't an Al-Qaeda or ISIS operative in Iraq at all outside of the Kurdish town of Sulaymaniyah under Saddam Hussein's regime. Didn't exist until we invaded Iraq. And Syria, you know, Yemen, all of the rest of these are Libya even. We did a good job of breaking some of those things. Some of them are coming back together. They're not all failed states. I served in Libya, and Libya had a great ISIS presence, and they have since resolved that issue, and now they're working their way back out through the militia world. But for the most part, the rest of the Middle East is relatively peaceful, relatively calm, going on as it's done for centuries with people who just want to have their free religion and to get their kids through school. And we need to respect and understand that that still exists. These cookie cutter images that we have of the Muslim world and the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asia, many of these are our big trading partners. You just think of Iraq and Syria as the Middle East, and it's not.
Let me end the forum with two advertisements. One, take a look at the Annals volume.
Yes.
And not just the volume on terrorism and CVE, but take a look at the Annals in general, because it's a great local journal, local here at Penn, but draws an international reputation, international authors. And if you're interested in the Middle East, take a look at the Middle East Institute, again, mei.edu.
And with that, thank you, Richard Clarke, for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.